Can you hear me? Yeah? I think it's better if I stand up. If I sit down there, I shall probably fall asleep. I always get the graveyard slot at Oxford. I don't know why. I think it's because they know that I slip off to have a siesta. So to make sure I don't slip off, they say, well, he can give the first paper after lunch. So, unfortunately, as we had no wine, there's a chance I'll stay awake long enough to get to the end.
That was the idea.
Yes, I suspected it was, Edwin. We should have to make up for it later. In the winter of 1570 to 71, which was particularly cold and wet, some 80,000 Moriscos, men, women and children, old and young alike, from the Kingdom of Granada, were rounded up and deported from their homeland in groups of varying sizes. Those in charge were given orders to take them north and thus as far away from Granada as possible. In some cases, they were supposed to march them to the old Kingdom of Leon. It's estimated that some 30,000 Moriscos died en route from hunger, the cold and illness, most notably typhoid fever. Even those who had organised the deportation, such as Don Juan de Austria, Don John of Austria, took pity on them. He wrote to his very good friend, Ruy Gómez de Silva, Prince of Eboli, "Those who left yesterday were caught by such a strong downpour on their way out of the city that they could hardly walk. To tell the truth, if these people have sinned, they are certainly paying for it." If Don Juan, from the distance of Granada itself, could take pity on the deportees, how much more so those who had to accompany them in their forced march north. Very quickly, the captains in charge realized that the death rate was such that they would soon have no Moriscos to accompany. Thus they took the humane decision to stop and spend the rest of the winter where they'd got to. For many, this meant somewhere in La Mancha, the Campo de Calatrava or Extremadura. Not sufficiently far away from Granada for the government in Madrid, but a sensible move on the part of the soldiers, who proceeded to billet their charges on as many small towns and villages as they could find in the area. Since some of these places already had Morisco inhabitants living there, the famous Mudéjares, often known as Moriscos Antiguos, the old Moriscos, they were assured of a welcome. In addition, most of the vast area between Toledo in the north and the Sierra Morena was traditionally a land of low-density population, so that any new hands were always very welcome, especially when so many of the Moriscos from Granada were expert farm hands and market gardeners. But among them too were a substantial number of skilled and professional types, merchants, shopkeepers, teachers, notaries, lawyers, and so on. Their skills would also be welcome in the area. One of the largest contingents of Granadine Moriscos was temporarily parked in Albacete, on the fringes of the Mancha. From there, family groups were sent out to local towns and villages. One such, consisting of 12 families, went to the village of Esquivias, northeast of Toledo, in between Illescas and Aranjuez, in an area known as La Sagra. Another group ended up in El Toboso. When Miguel de Cervantes arrived in Esquivias in 1584 to marry Catalina de Salazar y Palacios, he would almost certainly have met some of the Granadine Moriscos settled there. Although their original settlement was supposed to have, I seem to have managed to lose a page. Here we are. Sorry. It was supposed to have been only temporary before being marched on further north when the weather improved, the winter was over. The central authorities quickly forgot about them, and the captains in charge of their deportation were more than happy to leave off a job most had found profoundly upsetting. By 1584, this is 14 years now after their deportation, the 12 Morisco families had integrated well into the local society and were on their way up socially. One of the new arrivals was a merchant and shopkeeper. His name was Bernardino Ricote. Ring any bells? And he married Isabel Mejia, daughter of an Hidalgo family of Esquivias. Not something the other Hidalgos looked kindly on, but it was a trend that only increased as the years went by. Many of the Moriscos who had arrived in Esquivias in 1570 ended up marrying into the local Hidalguía class, Especially, they married into the Quixote family. Ricote and Quixote. The Cervantine resonances are unmistakable. During the 3 years or so Cervantes spent in Esquivias, it's likely that he made journeys to various local towns and villages as he administered the rents of his new family. Toledo, certainly, as capital of the region. El Toboso, perhaps, where some 40% of the population were Morisco. Nearby to El Toboso were Quintana de la Orden, a village mentioned in Part 1, Chapter 4, well known for its large converso, Jewish converso population. And the Campo de Criptana, famous for its line of windmills high up on the ridge to catch the wind. From Campo de Criptana, it is but a short journey to Alcázar de San Juan, another converso town, and thence on to Puerto Lápice. West of Puerto Lápice is Villarrubia de los Ojos, where local legend situates La Peña de Marcela, Part 1, Chapter 14. Given that it is the only place near to Puerto Lápice mentioned in Part 1, Chapter 8 that has a sierra behind it, and thus a possible peak on which Marcela could stand to deliver her famous speech, the choice is not completely far-fetched. In the same area, but a bit further south, of course, we find Las Lagunas de Ruidera and the Cave of Montesinos. The point that I'm trying to make is that Cervantes knew this area extremely well. And this is evident particularly in Part 1 of his novel. As already noted, it was an area with significant communities of Moriscos, Old and Granadine, and Jewish conversos, both of which were of course to be found in places such as Toledo. And Cervantes must have got to know them quite well, certainly the Ricotes of Esquivias. Furthermore, if we look at other periods of his life, especially during his formative years, we find that he'd lived at various times in Alcalá de Henares, famous for the Complutense University, which had welcomed the humanist Erasmus there in the 1520s, Valladolid, where an alleged group of Lutherans were discovered in the late 1550s while Cervantes was in his teens, and Seville, where another cell of Lutherans was found in the Geronimite monastery of San Isidoro. Cervantes was born into a Spain that was significantly different to the Spain he returned to from captivity in Algiers in 1580. It was still, before his captivity, in his early years, it was still a relatively open society where different ethnic and religious groups coexisted, where the Inquisitor General was the Erasmist Alonso Manrique and not the fanatic Fernando de Valdés, where the king's daughter and regent, Juana de Austria, was a closet Jesuit, close to numerous reformed groups, with friends amongst the Alumbrados or Illuminists, and those who would later be condemned as Lutheran heretics, for example, the Cafalla family. We've tended to see the Spain of the 16th century, I think, from the perspective of what it became under Philip II, and not from the perspective of what it was earlier in the century, and what it might have been had things turned out otherwise. In many ways, it seems to me, Cervantes recreates in Don Quixote the world that he grew up in, the world that his parents lived through, the world that probably he would have liked to have grown old in. Maybe the world that still existed just in scattered form, hidden away under the post-Tridentine conforming surface. There's probably no more famous opening to a novel than that of Don Quixote. En un lugar de la Mancha de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme. In English, I suspect that Jane Austen's "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife" comes pretty close, but it doesn't have the playfulness of the Cervantine text, where it's clear that the author-narrator knows exactly where the novel is situated. He isn't going to tell us. He doesn't say, "de cuyo nombre no me acuerdo," I just don't remember it, or "no puedo acordarme." He says deliberately, "no quiero," I have no intention of telling you. He's making it very clear right from the start who is in charge. As author-narrator, he controls the information, and he doesn't intend to tell us everything that he knows. In a society watched over by the ever-vigilant Inquisition, that is probably a sound tactic. From this narratorial ploy, we move seamlessly to the protagonist. His status as an hidalgo, his pursuits, he has a hunting dog, and perhaps surprisingly, and we're just in the first paragraph of the novel, his eating habits. Uno olla de algo más baja que carnero, salpicón las más noches, duelos, for whatever reason I didn't put a translation in here, sorry. Duelos y quebrantos los sábados, lentejas los viernes, aún palomino los domingos. Now these emphases seem a strange way to begin a novel. They're then followed by a short discussion over the surname of the protagonist, for which three possibilities are given us: Quijada, Quesada, Quijana. The withholding of vital information that we saw in the opening sentence now takes on apparently ridiculous proportions. We are not even allowed to know the protagonist's real name. Indeed, we do not find this out until the very last chapter of Part 2 from 1615, when we read that his true name was Alonso Quijano. That's to say, not one of the three names posited to us in Chapter 1 of the Part 1. The rest of Chapter 1 is taken up with the creation of the character, Don Quixote, a new identity, a new name, a new purpose in life. Our knight-errant will set out ex nihilo, as if born anew. I'm now going to suggest that these three elements, the opening, the food consumed, and the creation of a new identity, have something in common. Indeed, that they're bound together via a common factor, and I recognise that I'm treading on eggshells here, or more likely pointed daggers, but anyway. It's likely that a reader of Don Quixote Part 1 in 1605 would have recognised the opening of the novel, En un lugar de la Mancha. It is, after all, a perfect octosyllable, followed, as it happens, by a perfect hendecasyllable, de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme. Interesting. Maybe that's why the opening is just so wonderful. It's because it's poetic. It's an octosyllable followed by a hendecasyllable. And indeed, we find the octosyllable in a ballad from the Romancero General of 1600. Un lencero portugués recién venido a Castilla, más valiente que Rodán y más galán que Macías, en un lugar de la Mancha que no le saldrá en su vida, se enamoró muy despacio de una bella casadilla. In the ballad, the Portuguese linen merchant falls in love with a married woman, but it all ends badly as he's beaten up, rather as Don Quixote will be repeatedly, of course, throughout the novel. Portuguese merchants were regular visitors to Castile towards the end of the 16th century, after the annexation of Portugal by Philip II in 1580. But Portuguese cloth merchants or tailors were invariably associated in the popular mind with Portuguese Jewish converts, often called in Castile marranos. Cervantes would have known that that was what underlines the meaning of this particular ballad. Did he choose it because of that, or in spite of it? Alonso Quijano's diet has been brilliantly analysed by Barry Ive, sitting over there, who has shown how deficient it was in many basic nutrients and proteins, and if that was your diet, you probably would go mad. But it's also striking how it concentrates on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the holy days of the three great religions of the book. Lentos on Fridays, duelos y quebrantos, and do we really know what that means? Egg and bacon, egg and chorizo, egg and torreznos, something like that. And a pigeon perhaps on a Sunday. Kenneth Brown has suggested that Alonso Quijano's diet is very much that of a Jewish converso living in La Mancha at that time, and that together with the clear reference to Portuguese Jews in the opening octosyllable, Cervantes is pointing us to a particular reading. When to that we add the rest of Chapter 1 and the creation of a new identity, the resonances with Spanish Jewish converts are too loud to be ignored. If there was one group who knew all about changing names, creating new identities, starting out afresh, it was Spain's Jewish population. Although they were nominally expelled in March 1492, James Amelang has argued that at least 100,000 of them had returned to Spain by the end of the 1490s. That is, within 10 years of their expulsion, at least 100,000 had returned to Spain. And that together with their already converted relatives, they began a long but not slow process to merge in with the general population. Their success can be measured by the fact that during the course of the 16th century, the number of prosecutions by the Inquisition of supposed Spanish Judaizers went down significantly. By the time Cervantes was writing, converted Jews had all but disappeared from view. They were still there, of course, hidden among the general population, living and working like everyone else, but most no longer stood out as conversos. The trials of Jewish converts at the end of the 16th century and into the 17th are almost invariably Portuguese Jews, the marranos. You find very, very few Spanish Jews in the trial records. Quintana de la Orden, San Clemente, Alcázar de San Juan, Argamasilla de Alba all had numerous converso families living in them. And we should note that one of Don Quixote's early routes took him through all or most of these towns or villages. In addition, Argamasilla is usually claimed to be his birthplace because of the opening poems, in the preliminaries. One of the things that's always struck me about the novel is that at no point does Don Quixote actually enter a church. The nearest he gets is when he and Sancho accidentally bump into the church of El Toboso in the middle of the night when they're looking for Dulcinea, and he utters the immortal words, "Con la iglesia hemos dado Sancho." But still they do not go inside. On other occasions, when Don Quixote meets up with priests, monks or friars on his journey, his first reaction is usually to beat them up. Also noteworthy, I think, is that when the village priest and the canon of Toledo come face to face in part 1, chapters 47 to 48, the last thing they talk about is religion. All they focus on is literature and literary decorum. These are two theologians, but they don't mention theology at all. There are other more subtle attacks on the church and what it stands for, of course. The burning of Don Quixote's books is a clear parody of the Inquisition, and its arbitrary attacks on so-called heretics. I think Ryan Prendergast has shown this brilliantly in a recent book. It's not just the burning of the books, it's the fact that if you actually look at it carefully, it's the totally arbitrary nature of which books are to be burnt and which are not. There's no rhyme or reason. And this is a powerful attack on the Inquisition and the way it dealt with any discontents, any rebels, and so on, heretics. There is the constant questioning of a single truth and the issue of authority. Perhaps even more dangerously, Cervantes calls into question the whole nature of faith. Faith in the eyes of the Christian church is everything. One must have faith and not question it, nor ask for proofs or evidence of God's existence. Don Quixote follows this in the tasks he sets all those he comes across. They must find Dulcinea, and they must swear homage to her as his lady love. When asked how these people are going to recognize her, or even more pertinently, why on earth they should do this in the first place, where is the proof? Don Quixote's answer is always the same. They must have faith and believe in what he has told them. Faith in Dulcinea is equated inevitably with faith in God. Now this, I would suggest, is a very dangerous stance to take in the early 17th century in Spain. The parody is quite clear, and as with the burning of the books, it's intended to subvert the authority of the church and all its institutions. At all turns, Cervantes undermines the authority that the Spanish church abrogated to itself. There is not a single author or authority in his text, the text that he presents to us. Truth and reality are multi-layered and fragmented. The authorities are often corrupt or incompetent. Furthermore, he presents to the reader a text supposedly written by an Arab, mediated by a bilingual Morisco from Toledo, and narrated by a Castilian. And to top it all off, the missing text is found in the old Alcana, or Jewish market area of Toledo, among a bunch of papers being hawked around by a young lad. At this point, Cervantes makes the following fascinating observation. Now, the translations I'm using are from the Edith Grossman translation of the text, which I generally find is the one I relate to best. However, I think she's got it wrong here, and I will say why. I saw that it was written in characters I knew to be Arabic, And since I recognised but could not read it, I looked around to see if some Morisco who knew Castilian and could read it for me was in the vicinity. And it was not very difficult to find this kind of interpreter, for even if I had sought a speaker of a better and older language, I would have found him. That's to say, even if he were looking for a Hebrew translator, he would have had no difficulty in finding one in Toledo. A curious and revealing comment on the multicultural diversity of the city of the three religions, even at the end of the 16th century, and of Cervantes' knowledge of this. But go back to the text. Edith Grossman translates Morisco who knew Castilian. What Cervantes writes is, si parecía por ahí algún Morisco aljamiado que los leyese. That is not the same. I think what Cervantes is saying is the text that's been discovered is an aljamiado text. That is to say, the language is Castilian, but the characters are Arabic. Cervantes knows this, but since he can't read the characters, he can't read the text. So what he's looking for is a Morisco who knows Arabic letters and will be able to transliterate the text. Not translate. He doesn't translate the text. He has to transliterate it. Right? I think there's a major difference. And it's a major point that Cervantes is making. Aljamiado texts generally came from Aragon. There are very few in Castile, the Mancebo de Arévalo, but there are very few, the majority. The vast majority of Aljamiado texts were written in Aragon and circulated from there. So I think it's an interesting point. And yet, of course, he tells us that Cide Hamete Benengeli comes from La Mancha. And it's been suggested that he comes from Almagro because of his name, which is a pun on berenjenas. And Almagro is a denominación de origen de berenjenas. Make of that what you will. But I think the text that Cervantes is much more multi-layered. It's not this is not an Arabic text being translated into Castilian. No, this is an aljamiado text that has to be transliterated into Castilian. Now, the idea that you're just going to come across a sort of 15, 16-year-old Morisco boy with the capacity to do this is, of course, hilarious. It's most unlikely that they would have existed. But anyway, there we are. But I say it seems to be a very revealing comment on Toledo and its diversity of faiths and religions. Indeed, the multicultural diversity of Spain, I think, lies at the heart of his great novel. If Don Quixote is portrayed as possibly a Jewish conversion, I state it no more strongly. But let us note that Sancho refers to his own status as Cristiano Viejo, old Christian, on at least 4 occasions. And in part 2, chapter 8, he declares himself to be a mortal enemy of the Jews. Don Quixote utters not a word about his own origin, and he never says anything derogatory about the Jews. His lady love, Dulcinea del Toboso, comes from a village noted for its large Morisco population, and the names of her parents and her activities suggest very strongly that she is a Morisca. Sancho's neighbour and friend in part 2 is the Morisco Ricote. So that while the world of Judaism is only hinted at in various subtle ways, the world of Islam is openly present in the novel. Other than the characters already mentioned, we have Zoraida from the Captive Captain's Tale, Ricote's daughter Anna Felix, who turns up dressed as a Turkish corsair, then claims to be Mujer y Cristiana, a woman and a Christian, but shortly afterwards is referred to as Morisca Cristiana, a Christian Morisca, in love with a Christian boy, the son of a wealthy knight. And finally, we have Don Álvaro Tarfe, a Morisco from Granada, who is often overlooked in this novel, but who plays, I think, a fundamental part in Cervantes' thinking. It is possibly the case that Cervantes had no intention of introducing the character of Álvaro Tarfe at all when he first sketched out part 2 of Don Quixote. That's assuming, of course, that he sketched anything out. It does seem more likely that he just sort of stumbled his way forward. That is, until he read Avellaneda's spurious continuation and decided to take up the challenge thrown down by his rival, who had introduced this character early on in the novel. In chapter 1, indeed, he takes up 2 challenges thrown down in Avellaneda's first chapter. The other is the fact that Avellaneda, following up a hint given in the last chapter of part 1 of Cervantes' novel, decides to send his 2 heroes off to the jousts in Zaragoza. Cervantes had written that the 3rd time Don Quixote left home, he went to Zaragoza and took part in the most famous tourneys ever held in that city. Cervantes, who has his heroes on the road to Zaragoza, changes tack and sends them off instead to Barcelona, thereby discrediting his rival's work. No, you sent them off to Zaragoza, that's wrong. The proper text, they go to Barcelona. On their way to Zaragoza, in Avellaneda's text, they meet up with a knight, and I quote, who was called Don Alvaro Tarfe and descended from the ancient lineage of the Tarfe Moors from Granada, closely related to their kings and valiant through their own persons, as we read in the histories of the kings of that kingdom, of the Abencerrajes, Tegríes, Gomeles and Mazas, who became Christians after the Catholic King Ferdinand captured the worthy city of Granada. Don Alvaro is also going to Zaragoza in this version. Not one to waste an opportunity, Cervantes takes up the character but sends him in the opposite direction, not towards Zaragoza, but away from it and back to Granada. For, as he says, I, señor, am going to Granada, which is my home. Voy a Granada, que es mi patria. Cervantes' description of Don Alvaro is much more succinct than Avellaneda's. In fact, you can't really understand him at all if you haven't read Avellaneda's text. He relies on his reader knowing the original, which seems to me a curious way of giving credence to the continuation, a continuation he clearly detested. So it's sort of paradoxical, he detests the continuation, but actually, to make any sense of what he's doing, you have had to read the Avellaneda text. If we haven't read it, then we don't know from Cervantes' text that Álvaro Tarfe is descended from one of the noble Moorish families of Granada who converted to Christianity after the conquest in 1492. We're given almost no details about him at all. Only by knowing the Avellaneda text are we aware that he is a Moor. Now, we don't know if Álvaro Tarfe is one of those who converted at the moment of the fall of Granada, as a number of noble Moors did, or whether he waited until forced to do so by the decree of conversion of 1502. Either is possible. What is also not clear, deliberately so in my opinion, is if Don Álvaro is one of the many Granadine Moriscos returning from expulsion. In other words, another Ricote, or whether he's just travelling the country and on his way back home, having been exempted from the decrees of expulsion, as many were. But he is another instance of Cervantes' real knowledge of the situation of the Moriscos at this time and of his undoubted sympathies for them. I think he's an interesting character, Álvaro Tarfe. So it's not, we always think there's only one returning Morisco is Ricote. No, there are possibly 2. Now, if we look at the Ricote, as I've argued elsewhere a number of times, Cervantes' description of him in Part 2, Chapter 54, suggests very strongly that he is an old Morisco, a former Mudéjar from the Mancha. He shares all the traits of these folks settled in the area for many centuries, perfectly adapted to their environment, well on the road to assimilation. Remember, he's at least one social class higher than Sancho, probably more. Ricote is literate and is a shopkeeper. Again, obviously Cervantes' parody, the old Christian is a complete and utter illiterate, whereas the Morisco being expelled is actually of a much higher social class. Sancho's description of the expulsion of the Moriscos from the village, among them Ricote's wife and daughter, is a very moving depiction of the real ties that existed between Moriscos and old Christians in the area, and of the anger and sadness that many Christians felt at losing their neighbours and friends. But as I've noted earlier in this talk, Cervantes may well have had in mind the family of Bernardo Ricote and his descendants when he created the Morisco Ricote, and these were Granadine Moriscos, who had only been settled in the Mancha since 1570. Most probably, he merged the 2 types in his portrayal of Ricote. The Ricote he had known in Esquivias, plus the emblematic name of the last Moriscos to be expelled from Spain, from the Valle de Ricote in Murcia, expelled from November 1613. Their expulsion was so manifestly unjust, was heavily criticised at the time, that the choice of name Ricote was bound to strike a chord in any reader of Part 2 in 1615. Now, most readers of this episode have concentrated on the fact that Ricote had returned to his native village to look apparently for his hidden treasure and to find out news of his wife and daughter and where they might be living now, since he wants to bring the family back together again. But he has no intention of doing this in Spain. However many tears he has shed over the country and its expulsion of his people, Ricote has come back temporarily. He is not intending to stay. He sees his future in Germany because he says, "There it seemed to me I could live in greater freedom, because the inhabitants don't worry about subtleties. Each man lives as he chooses, because in most places there is freedom of conscience." Now, these are strong words to be spoken aloud in early modern Spain. Freedom of conscience was not a concept that the Spanish Church or Inquisition easily recognized, nor should it be said many other countries of the time. Indeed, one wonders which part of Germany exactly Ricote is talking about, since most German states still practice the dictum cuius regio eius religio. If you lived in a Protestant state, you were a Protestant. If you lived in a Catholic state, then you were a Catholic. And there was precious freedom of conscience in either. He mentions a place near Augsburg where he says he's taken a house. And it was, of course, at Augsburg in 1555 that the concept of cuius regio was agreed as a way of ending the religious wars in Germany. And yet again, it would appear we are dealing with Cervantine irony. But however unlikely to be true, Ricote's statement allows Cervantes to make his point. Freedom of conscience is an ideal to be pursued, and it goes hand in hand with another one of his principles, freedom of the will. Upholding any one of these principles, and I'm coming to the end, brought him into collision with the Spanish Church. And we would do well to note that Don Quixote was not subject to any censure from the authorities, or not any censure that I'm aware of. It seems to have got through. And yet, if you think about it, we have the amusing parody of the Inquisition in Part 1, the burning of the books, the terrifying burlesque auto da fe of Part 2, Chapter 69, where Sancho is dressed in a San Benito and the conical hat worn by those about to be burned at the stake. We have the constant poking fun at the church and its ministers and officials, the subversion of authority at every turn, the positive view of Arabs, Moriscos and Islam, the subtle references to Jewish converts and so on. In Don Quixote, Cervantes presents the reader with a view of the Spain that I believe he would have liked to find himself in a multicultural Spain where diversity is celebrated and not persecuted. Some years ago, I wrote the following in a review of a collective volume of essays on Cervantes and religion. And I just shouldn't do this, but I will quote myself. As for Don Quixote itself, this reader, moi, came away with the vision of a new Christian hidalgo of Jewish origins, joining up with his old Christian neighbour and social inferior, Sancho Panza, riding through many of the crypto-Jewish and Morisco villages of La Mancha, in order to offer up victories to his lady-love Dulcinea, who in real life is a Morisco peasant girl from a village full of Moriscos, and meeting a host of individuals with flexible and indeterminate sexual and social identities, women who become men, men women, Christians Moors, Moors Christians, peasant girls princesses, farm labourers governors, barbers and students knights. Added to which, not once has our hero set foot in a church or hear mass, and the two occasions when he comes across members of the mendicant orders, he beats them up. Finally, when he wakes up from his deep sleep at the end of the novel, his first words are, "Bendito sea el poderoso Dios," which are strikingly similar to the words uttered by Cide Hamete Benengeli at the start of Part 2, Chapter 8, "Bendito sea el poderoso Allah." Words which López Baralt has reminded us come from the opening surah of the Quran. Could there be better proof of Cervantes' Catholic views on religious matters? Well, I would still subscribe to those thoughts today and rejoice in the multicultural world that Cervantes lays before us in that wonderful novel, Don Quixote de la Mancha. Thank you.